They told me the meeting was about future-proofing the brand. That was the first lie. My name is Gordon MacLeod. I'm 53 years old, and for 19 years, I was the head brewmaster at Old Anchor Brewery. More than that, I was its heart. The man sitting across the polished mahogany table was Julian Croft. He was 34, with a Wharton MBA, a jawline that looked engineered, and a Brioni suit that probably cost more than my first car. He represented Apex Capital Partners, the private equity firm that had bought out my old partner David 6 months ago. He held the title of CEO, but he had never touched a sack of malt in his life. He began, his voice smooth and confident, the kind of voice that had never been told no. I just nodded. I knew what was coming. You don't get called into the main conference room with an HR representative you've never met to be praised. The air smelled of lemon polish and corporate anxiety. Quote 3, he continued, steepling his perfectly manicured fingers. Quote 4, he paused, expecting me to understand the word salad he'd just tossed. I understood it perfectly. I was being fired. The HR woman, whose nameplate read Cynthia, slid a thick folder across the table. I didn't touch it. I kept my eyes on Julian. My hands rested on my knees, calm. Inside, a cold, hard clarity was forming, like ice on a winter lake. You built a wonderful artisanal product, Gordon, Julian said, his tone dripping with condescension. But we're scaling for a national market now. We need systems, not stories. We've brought in a new head of beverage innovation with a background in food science and logistics from Cornell. He's going to streamline things. Streamline, optimize, agile. These were the words men like Julian used to gut a place of its soul. I was the old infrastructure being replaced by a shiny new pipeline. I knew for sure 3 weeks ago when I saw the job posting on LinkedIn. Head of beverage innovation for a regional brewery in my exact location. The requirements were all about supply chain management and chemistry degrees, not a single mention of brewing experience. They were hiring my replacement before they even told me I was leaving. They thought firing me would be the end of the story. They were wrong. If you appreciate stories about quiet competence beating loud arrogance, hit that like button and subscribe right now. You'll find that this channel is dedicated to people who refuse to be erased by those who value spreadsheets more than skill. To understand what happened next, you have to understand how Old Anchor Brewery was born. It wasn't in a boardroom. It was in a damp 2-car garage in 2005, with me and David Miller. I was 34, laid off from a big brewery that had been bought out and consolidated. David was 40, a former accountant who had sunk his life savings into a dream. We had a collection of used dairy tanks we'd welded ourselves, and a leaky roof. For the first 2 years, we didn't take a salary. We lived on our wives' paychecks and the stale crackers we kept in a toolbox. I drove my 1998 Ford F-150 to make deliveries myself after brewing for 12 hours. We were brewers, bottlers, janitors, and salesmen. David handled the books, I handled the beer. Our breakthrough came in 2007. It was a recipe I had been working on for months in my spare time, tweaking it in my head while I tried to sleep. An amber ale. Rich, malty, but with a clean, crisp hop finish that was different from anything else on the market. We called it Harbor Master Amber. It was an instant hit. It wasn't just a good beer. It was the right beer at the right time. Harbor Master Amber put us on the map. It won a gold medal at the Great American Beer Festival in 2008. Orders exploded. We moved out of the garage and into a real facility. We hired staff. Over the next decade, I developed our other core beers. North Star Stout, a rich oatmeal stout with notes of coffee and chocolate, and Beacon IPA, a balanced West Coast IPA that became a local legend. Those 3 beers accounted for 78% of our total sales. They were the pillars that held up the entire company. And here's the part that Julian Croft, with all his due diligence and financial modeling, missed. Back in 2005, when we were still broke, David and I had a conversation. We were sitting on upside-down buckets, drinking a test batch. The brewery was 3 months from insolvency. "Gordy," David had said, his face etched with worry. "I can't pay you what you're worth. I can't even pay you minimum wage right now. But I know what you're creating. It's art." He looked me dead in the eye. A recipe is an artist's signature. I'm not asking you to give it away. The brewery doesn't own your brain. Those recipes, Harbor Master, anything else you come up with, they're yours, your intellectual property. We'll operate under a handshake licensing agreement. When we can afford it, we'll get the lawyers to draw up a formal contract and pay you a real royalty. Until then, your ownership of the recipes is my promise to you. That was David. His word was his bond. We got successful, and we got busy. We talked about formalizing it a dozen times, but something always came up. A new expansion, a problem with a distributor, a global pandemic. The paperwork never got filed. The handshake deal remained. He paid me a great salary, gave me profit sharing, and I was content. I trusted him completely. Then, 2 years ago, David got sick. A nasty fight with cancer that he ultimately won, but it drained him. He decided to retire, spend his time with his grandkids. He sold his 72% ownership stake to Apex Capital Partners for a life-changing amount of money. I didn't blame him for a second. He'd earned it. The day the deal closed, David pulled me aside. He looked older, tired, but his eyes were clear. Gordy, these Apex guys are sharks. They talk a good game, but they see everything as a line item. Did we ever formalize that recipe agreement? My stomach tightened. No, we never got around to it. He nodded slowly. That might be for the best. Don't mention it. Let them assume it's a corporate asset. A handshake with me is one thing. A handshake with them isn't worth the air it's spoken on. Just keep your head down and keep making good beer. That was his last piece of advice to me. The breaking point came in February 2020. I had just turned 51. My daughter Chloe was a sophomore at Texas A&M, studying to be a veterinarian. Her tuition was not cheap. My house was finally paid off, a modest 3-bedroom ranch I'd bought in 1999. My retirement was a mix of a 401k and the profit-sharing plan David had set up. Everything I had was tied to that brewery. It wasn't just a job, it was my life's work, my family's security. And Julian Croft was taking it away with a smile and a folder full of corporate jargon. I looked at the folder, then back at him. My voice was steady, measured. I see. We wish you the best in your future endeavors, Gordon, Julian said, already standing up, ready to move on to his next optimization. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings. He didn't offer a handshake. I wouldn't have taken it. A dead calm settled over me. This wasn't a defeat. It was a declaration of war they didn't even know they'd made. They thought they were just trimming fat. What they had actually done was amputate the heart of their own company and hand it to me in a cardboard box. As the security guard, a young kid named Marcus, who I'd shared beers with at the company Christmas party, walked me to my office. I felt a strange sense of peace. Julian's mistake wasn't just arrogance. It was a catastrophic failure of research. He had read the financial statements, but he had never read the man who created the value in them. He owned the factory, but I owned the formula. I packed my box, my favorite hydrometer, a framed photo of me and David from 2006, covered in wart and grinning like idiots, a worn copy of, quote, 18, and in the bottom, a stack of worn, spiral-bound notebooks dating back to 2005, filled with my handwriting, detailing every single iteration of every recipe I'd ever created. My signature was on the first page of each one. Marcus looked uncomfortable. Sorry about this, Mr. McLeod. It's not right. It's just business, Marcus, I said, my voice even. Don't you worry about it. He walked me to my F-150, the same truck, now 26 years old, but it still ran like a top. Some things, when built with care, are meant to last. I drove home, not in a rage, but in a state of crystalline focus. I didn't call my wife to tell her I'd lost my job. I didn't pour a whiskey and stare at the wall. I went into my study, pulled out the shoebox from the top of the closet where I kept my old notes, and I made a phone call. Sarah was an IP attorney, sharp as a tack. I'd met her through a friend years ago. She specialized in trade secrets and intellectual property for small businesses. We met the next morning. I laid out everything on her conference room table. My notebooks, the story of my handshake deal with David, the timeline of the Apex acquisition. She listened intently, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. Gordon, this is fascinating. They have no written assignment of your intellectual property, no work for hire clause in an employment contract that explicitly states the company owns your creations. There was no employment contract, I said. Not in the early days. It was just a handshake. I got a W-2 and a paycheck. That was it. A slow smile spread across her face. Then they have a very, very big problem. A recipe, if kept secret and having commercial value, is a classic trade secret. It belongs to its creator unless explicitly signed away. They didn't buy your recipes from David because David never owned them to sell. He was operating under an informal license, which you are now free to revoke. Her advice was precise. We do nothing. We wait. Wait for what? I asked. For them to commit infringement. Every batch of Harbor Master Amber they brew without your permission, every keg they sell, is a new violation. We let them dig their own hole. In the meantime, we document. So that's what we did. For the next 3 months, I became a ghost, an intelligence operative monitoring my own legacy. I had friends who were distributors. They sent me batch codes and production dates. I bought 6-packs of Harbor Master Amber, Beacon IPA, and North Star Stout from 3 different stores every Monday. We sent the samples to a lab in Houston for gas chromatography analysis. The reports came back every time with the same conclusion. The chemical fingerprint of the beer was identical to my control samples from before I was fired. They hadn't changed a thing. The new head of beverage innovation, a 28-year-old kid named Kevin, was just following the brew sheets I'd written, thinking he was a genius. Sarah compiled a file. Every lab report, every sales report from my distributor contacts. We calculated their revenue from my beers since my termination. After 87 days, the number was already north of $16.8 million in gross sales. Meanwhile, Julian Croft was on a victory tour. He was featured in, quote, 31 magazine, talking about, quote, 32. He posted pictures on LinkedIn from his office, the brewery tanks gleaming in the background. Hashtag leadership, hashtag innovation, hashtag growth. He was so proud of his new machine, completely oblivious to the fact that he didn't own the fuel it ran on. The first cracks started to show around week 10. A friend who still worked in the cellar called me one night, his voice low. Gordy, something's wrong. The last 3 batches of amber have had this weird diacetyl slick. Tastes like movie theater popcorn butter. Kevin can't figure it out. He's just throwing more hops at it. I knew exactly what it was. Our yeast strain, one I had personally cultivated and maintained for over a decade, was sensitive. It needed to be coaxed. If you rushed the fermentation or didn't give it a proper rest at a specific temperature, it would kick off impurities. It was a nuance you couldn't write on a brew sheet. It was something you felt, something you knew from years of experience. 2 weeks later, the emergency happened. A major retail chain, Total Beverage, placed a hold on a $1.8 million order. A customer had returned a 6-pack of Harbor Master Amber, complaining it tasted off. The chain's quality control department tested their stock and found inconsistencies across multiple batches. They sent a formal notice to Old Anchor. Fix the quality control, or the contract was in jeopardy. That was the kill shot. A $1.8 million order disappearing overnight was not something Julian could hide in a spreadsheet. It triggered alarm bells all the way up the Apex Capital food chain. They called an emergency board meeting for the following Tuesday at 10 a.m. Sarah got the news through a contact at Total Beverage's corporate office. "It's time," she said over the phone. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the excitement underneath. "They're wounded. Now we go in for the final move." Tuesday morning, I put on the only suit I owned. It felt strange and stiff. Sarah was waiting for me in the lobby of the downtown high-rise where Apex had their regional office. She was carrying a slim leather briefcase. "Ready?" she asked. "I've been ready for 87 days," I replied. We walked into the Old Anchor Brewery corporate offices at 10:15 a.m. The receptionist looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Mr. McLeod, can I help you?" "We're here for the board meeting," Sarah said, her voice leaving no room for argument. We walked past her and down the hall to the main conference room. Through the glass walls, I could see them. Julian Croft, looking stressed, standing at the head of the table. 4 other men in identical suits, the Apex partners. And Cynthia from HR, looking pale. Julian was in the middle of a sentence, gesturing at a PowerPoint slide titled Strategic Quality Realignment. He stopped cold when he saw us. His face, usually tanned and confident, went slack with shock. I pushed the door open. The room fell silent. "What is the meaning of this?" Julian sputtered, his voice suddenly an octave higher. "You're trespassing! Security!" "That won't be necessary, Mr. Croft," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the tension. She walked to the table and placed 2 thick, bound documents in front of him with a soft thud. "This," she said, tapping the first one, "is a formal cease and desist letter demanding an immediate halt to the production and sale of all products utilizing Mr. McLeod's proprietary trade secrets." She tapped the second document. "And this is a courtesy copy of a complaint filed this morning in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Texas. It alleges trade secret misappropriation, trademark infringement, and unjust enrichment. We are seeking damages, legal fees, and a permanent injunction." The 4 partners stared at the documents, then at Julian, then at me. The color drained from Julian's face. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He stammered. That's when I spoke for the first time. My voice was quiet, but it filled the silent room. I took a step forward. One of the partners, an older man with silver hair, picked up the legal complaint. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the exhibits, the lab reports, the sales figures, a sworn affidavit from David Miller confirming our original agreement. Julian was falling apart. The silver-haired partner looked up, his gaze like ice. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Julian. "Did you, or did your due diligence team, ever verify the chain of title for the company's core intellectual property?" Julian's mouth opened and closed. He had no answer. He had just assumed. It was the fatal flaw of the arrogant. They never questioned their own assumptions. Sarah laid out our terms. They were simple and non-negotiable. 1. An immediate halt to all production of the infringing beers. 2. Back payment of royalties for all infringing products sold to date. We calculated the total revenue at $16.8 million. We were demanding a 15% royalty payment, which came to $2,520,000, payable within 30 days. 3. A new formal licensing agreement going forward, or they could buy the recipes from me outright. "And what is your price for the recipes?" the silver-haired partner asked, his voice low. I looked him in the eye. $25 million. A sharp intake of breath somewhere in the room. The price was absurdly high, but it was meant to be. I didn't want to sell. I wanted my brewery back. The partner closed the document. He looked at Julian with utter contempt. Julian looked around the room, searching for an ally. He found none. He walked out of the room, not with a security escort, but alone, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Julian Croft was terminated that afternoon. His golden parachute was voided due to gross negligence and misrepresentation of company assets. The 28-year-old, quote, was let go the next day. The entire executive team Julian had brought in was purged within the week. The negotiations with Apex were intense, but they held no cards. They had a $120 million company that was legally forbidden from producing 78% of its product. Their entire investment was on the verge of becoming worthless. They tried to lowball, to threaten, to find loopholes. Sarah dismantled every argument. In the end, I didn't take the $25 million buyout. I took something far better. We settled 3 weeks later. The final agreement gave me 12% equity in Old Anchor Brewery, making me a minority partner, a permanent seat on the board of directors, and a 7% royalty on the gross revenue of my 3 core recipes, in perpetuity. They also covered all my legal fees, which amounted to just over $300,000. I was reinstated, but not as an employee. My new title was Chief Brewing Officer and Founder Emeritus. I was no longer someone they could fire. I was someone they had to answer to. My first day back was surreal. I walked through the brewery doors, and the smell of boiling wort and hops hit me like a homecoming. The brewing team, the same guys I had trained, broke into applause. The quality control issues that had baffled the Cornell kid for months? I identified the problem in 20 minutes and had it corrected by the end of the day. The yeast strain just needed to be handled properly. It needed a brewer, not a chemist. The total beverage order was reinstated and shipped a week later. The beer was perfect. As for Julian Croft, I heard he lost everything. Apex Capital's parent company came after him personally for the damages. His reputation in the private equity world was destroyed. The last I heard, he was working as a junior at a small firm in Delaware, the corporate equivalent of exile. He had to sell his BMW M5 and his downtown condo. The silver-haired partner, a man named Robert Sterling, became the interim CEO. He was ruthless, but he was smart. He understood value when he saw it. He treated me with a level of respect bordering on reverence. He knew I had saved his firm from writing off a 9-figure investment. 6 months later, I was sitting in a board meeting, my board meeting, in the same room where I had been fired. We were reviewing the Q3 numbers. Sales were up 18% since my return. We were discussing a new expansion into the Pacific Northwest. I looked around the table. The faces were different. The energy was different. It was a company focused on its product again, not on buzzwords. That evening, I drove home in my old F-150. I passed a Total Beverage store and saw a huge display of Harbor Master Amber stacked right by the entrance. A small, quiet satisfaction settled deep in my bones. When I got home, my daughter Chloe was there, home from college for the weekend. She was sitting at the kitchen table, studying. The royalty checks had already paid for the rest of her tuition, with enough left over to fund her own veterinary practice someday if she wanted. She said, looking up from her textbook. I smiled. True value isn't something you can quantify on a balance sheet or optimize with an algorithm. It's built over time, with skill, with patience, and with integrity. It resides in the knowledge and the hands of the people who do the work. Arrogance is loud and boasts of its own genius, but competence is quiet. It waits. And in the end, it proves its worth not with words, but with results. The contracts meant to keep you down can become the very tools that lift you up. Your value doesn't disappear just because someone else fails to see it. Thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to do so and hit the notification bell to get alerts about new stories like this one. Leave a comment and let me know what you think. I'll see you in the next video.